What's up, Butler? Wow, looking fresh.
Actually, I'll probably do
That.
So I'm gonna zoom you
You're gonna Zoom me, dude?
while I'm upstairs.
Okay. It's weird. I mean, you live here. You're gonna be upstairs watching me. Okay. Is that an egg wrap right there? Looks solid.
Yeah, quesadillas my girlfriend just made.
Nice. My girlfriend, I mean, staying upstairs, but she can bench like 400 pounds, so it's pretty impressive. All right, cool. We got some people. I'll share this screen. We'll knock some of this out. I think most of you know some of the basics that I'll start with. I didn't want to just go straight into the more advanced stuff without at least just talking quickly about some of the more basic stuff for taxiing. So cool. Taxiing is what we're going to recover. They were going to do SDPs today, and they asked me if I'd teach SDPs. And then since I've literally never done one, I was like, probably shouldn't teach it. So changed it up. We've been doing so many CTs lately that pretty much everything's been covered. So it looked like we hadn't talked about taxiing since like early April. And then with Lily breaking the jet and us having to do an uncastered 180, I thought could talk about that at the end, some anecdotal how that went stuff. So cool, let's get into it. Make it semi quick so we can all get back to our Friday. I'll go over wingtip clearances and visual references, obstacles in a turn and how far away from stuff you should be, the ops limits related to taxiing the airplane, and just general knowledge at 90 degree and greater than 90 degree turns. And then at the end, we'll talk about 180s, mid radius turns, and the castering system and how that's involved in doing all that stuff. Oh, that's annoying. Okay, cool. So wingtip clearance, as I think everybody is aware, based on the different sizes of an obstacle, you need to be a certain distance away from that obstacle. So the big picture on the right draws it out pretty well. If you've got something on the side of the airplane that's less than 3 feet, the 25 feet you need distance from it is measured from the main gear pod, and then that is 10 feet when you've got a wing walker. It's 25 feet and 10 feet again if the obstacle is between 3 and 6 feet, and that's measured from the outboard nacelle, and then 25 feet and 10 feet with a wing walker from the wingtip if it's greater than 6 feet. So the illustration there is pretty good for knowing that stuff, and I think if you've been in the C5 for even just a few missions, even from PIQ, they teach you that stuff pretty well because it's important so that you don't hit stuff with the airplane. And then the visual references on the left, everybody has their own visual references, can't be necessarily relied on because everybody sits at a different spot. But if you can see the bottom of something from the opposite side, so if you're sitting on the co-pilot side looking out the left window off the left wing, if you can see the bottom of it, you're pretty much set on 25 feet clearance from the wingtip. It's a good rule of thumb that'll keep you safe. Oh, Cosmo Kramer joining us. And you'll see the little superimposed drawing on the bottom left there that gives you a pretty good reference on if you walk your eye line up on like somewhere on the runway from those different lines on the outboard nacelle, that'll also give you 25 feet, 10 feet, and exactly where your wingtip is. So I won't pound that into the ground. I think most of us have been taught all that stuff. All right, so obstacles in a turn. This is a big one that I don't think everybody thinks about all the time. So on the left-hand side, I'm talking about tail growth when you're doing a 180-degree turn. And let's say there's an obstacle directly in front of you. How far away does it need to be from you for you to initiate that turn and not have to worry about slapping it with your tail? So the drawing there shows a pretty good representation of it. The answer is 215 feet. Guanch is raising his hand. Go ahead, Guanch. What up?
Yeah, I got a question on that. So I know you don't always have to like bust out a scanner to do the 150 feet or the 215 feet. Like some people can just like wag that with their eyes and kind of like determine what that is. I was wondering, do you have like a technique on that? Like just wagging it? Because I always tend to undercut it, especially if I have a lot of room.
Yeah. Yeah, so I had this conversation on my OME actually, where I got asked like, "How far do we need to be?" And I was like, "215 feet." And he was like, "Yeah." When does that really come into play? 215 feet looks pretty close, and it's only really going to become an issue for you if there's like a really tight turn they're trying to make you do. Generally, all of us initiate those turns well before 215 feet. I have never had to deplane a scanner and get it measured because it was so kind of close to the obstacle. It's more of, I would say, if you're like, if you feel like they're going to be driving you pretty close to an obstacle and having you do a 180, like this even shows like a building's right in front of you and they're trying to get you to go into a parking spot, or say there's a really tall pole right in front of you, like they have at different places. I personally don't have like a good, that looks like 215 feet. Like I generally always am super conservative about it. And then just knowing the number, and if you're worried about them trying to bring you in too close to it, then that's where I would deplane someone. I don't know if there aren't a whole lot of people in this CT. If there's people that have a better like visual reference wag for 215 feet in front of you, that's kind of a hard thing to do because you don't have any references off the airplane. You're just looking out at something. But no, I would just say like if you ever feel like it's getting close, I mean, you should get someone out there with the measuring tape, which as it says on the slide, we've got a measuring tape in all the trip kits, so they should be able to pop out and just measure how far away it is before you have to initiate a turn. But yeah, 215 feet is kind of the closest you will ever want to be. There are some conservative estimates in that math. I won't get into it. Doing the math, I have it written down, but basically it conservatively says like the nose wheel is going to track like 65 feet forward and it's going to scribe the full 18 and a half feet. Like there's a little bit of buffer built into the 215. Obviously, I'm not saying like 212 we're good, but if it's at 215, you should be safe. So if you get someone out there to measure it, that's what I would do. I wouldn't like give you a good wag for when is an okay time to just not measure it and do it. And then wingtip clearance on the right hand side. As it says, is 150 feet because you're not worried about the tail arcing out. And that gives you 115 feet from the center of the airplane out to the wing, some tail growth, and then 25 feet wingtip clearance is how they end up getting that number. And then they round it to 150. That's all on the dash one. But it says use the taxi rope, which we don't carry, so just use the measuring tape. All right, ops limits, pretty standard. For gross weights, up to 772. Limit your speed to 30 knots. You can brake in a turn. Don't stop in turns if able. Above 772, limit your taxi speed to 15. And then there's all the different things in the ops limits for castered versus fixed turns. Asymmetric and symmetric braking and thrust, and what your nose landing gear angle should be at. And I won't read those off to you guys. They're right there, and I think most of you know them. Some other speeds with taxiing in a congested area, stay 10 knots or slower. If it's icy, 5 knots. If you're going to taxi above 20 knots, you should have the anti-skid on. And a technique that people kind of teach is to taxi at your RCR. So about 12 knots when it's wet. And we already talked about 5 knots for AC. Airplane limits. some big ones that I have recently heard some stories about. I won't name any names, but if you're trying to taxi, if you end up stuck, oh, it's up. More people joining. If you end up stopping or stuck in a turn that you tried to caster in, and now your main landing gear are off by more than 4 degrees, well, now you can't taxi anymore. So they're going to have to tow you, or there's going to have to be some sort of way to straighten the main landing gear out, which is part of the reason that they advise and recommend you not to stop in a turn, especially a castered turn, because now you're going to be stuck. And then if you're going to turn the nose landing gear from a stopped position, which I've definitely had to do a couple of times, just knowing that you can turn it 30 degrees from where it's already at when you are castered or when the main landing gear are not at 0. But if the main landing gear are straight and centered, you can move the nose landing gear as much as 45 degrees. Now, I've talked to the engineers and they've told me that it's not a big deal, but just knowing that if you're super heavy and you're doing that and then pushing power, like you are putting a decent amount of stress on the strut there, but the limit is there for a reason. So if you need to do it, you're totally legal to do it. You're not going to break anything. I've seen people need to get the nose landing gear turned before they start moving just because we were pretty close to an obstacle and they didn't want to track forward. And then here are the big limits for the runway and taxiing. Min runway length, 6,000 feet. Min runway width, 147. And then taxi width is 75. Can be wavered down to 50. It doesn't say that in there. And then 180 degree turns. Big underlining point now is it's 150 feet of stressed pavement. So if the runway isn't 150 feet, you can still do a 180 on it if there is additional pavement that can give you 150 feet. We were talking about this yesterday in the bachelor pad, which, you know, that's all we do. We just talk about airplane stuff all the time. Is there used to be, if you were here a couple of years ago, a waiver in the Giant Report at Ramstein, because most of the ICAO fields, because they're measured in meters, are only 147 feet wide. But they removed most of those waivers because you can use the taxiway at the end of the runway to give yourself 150 feet. So the waiver isn't really required anymore. So I've seen people worry about that and be like, oh, I don't have 150 feet. And it's like, well, it's stressed pavement. So if you do it over there where we talk about having an out, then you do have 150 feet. So cool. Here is some techniques stolen from the taxi training guide about executing 90-degree turns and when to do them. So they talk about the wiper nut, which is circled and highlighted over there on the left-hand side of where that actually is, because for a long time as a co-pilot, I was just like, oh yeah, the wiper nut. And I was like, I don't know what that is. So you try to get that kind of on the center line there. And then as basically a center line is passing you, you caster and start your turn. And then the technique that I was taught that I also now use and really like is when I start a turn, I immediately go into 20 degrees into where I'm going. And then as I feel like kind of like my butt is passing the center line, I'll push it over into 40 degrees. And then when I feel like I'm ready to come out of the turn, I go back to 20 degrees. So instead of just going straight out of it, and then once I feel like we're centering up nicely is when I center and bring the nose landing gear back to 0. But to each their own. Taxiing is an art almost. So those are the techniques I use. That's the technique that the taxi training guide recommends. So there you go, for what it's worth. For greater than 90s, I was also taught and agree that it's easier to think about a greater than 90 as almost 2 different turns. You'll hear the phrase drive it deep a lot. So if you don't know what that means, they're basically saying you want to feel like you're passing your turn almost. Like, obviously, you know that you're supposed to be turning down that taxiway, but you almost want to continue straight ahead and not cheat over to the turn. until you've almost kind of started to pass it. And then you want to caster, and unlike a 90-degree turn, instead of initially going straight to 20, you go straight to 40. And you start kind of tracking towards the turn. And then halfway through it, it'll look just like a normal 90-degree turn. And then from there, you start your second turn and make that work out for you. I generally like to be closer to 10 knots. The technique people say is about 8 to 10 knots, because I think it's easier if you've got the weight requirements to use a little bit of brake to slow myself down if I feel like I'm getting fast than it is to feel yourself stalling and try and push up power and wait for that power to come in, and now you're going faster than you wanted to. I think it's easier to correct. So I like being a little faster at like 10 knots instead of starting to slow down and stall. And then here we go with 180s and min radius turns. So the Dash 1 has this full page about min radius turns. A min radius turn requires 150 feet of stressed pavement, like we talked about, not runway, stressed pavement. And a min radius turn requires more width, 198 to 218 feet if you are over 732.5 thousand pounds. I'll get into this on the next slide. And then you add 6 feet to those distances if the surface is wet. And then these pictures here, the one on the left is kind of what the runway or whatever surface you're on will look like out of the pilot's side window if you're trying to look down at the ground. And then just kind of a straight ahead view from the left seat on a runway where you're 4 feet from the edge, which is kind of where you want to start these turns to maximize using up the width that you have. Cool. So I highlighted the important parts. Hold on one sec, because I can't read my own stuff. I highlighted the important parts of a min radius turn out of the Dash 1. So the first one you'll see there is a min radius turn is defined as using the nose landing gear angle based on your gross weight. So those limits that we talked about earlier, the ops limits based on your weight, and then castering to 20 degrees, asymmetric power on the outside of the turn, and asymmetric braking on the inside of the turn, and then controlling your speed at 4 to 5 knots. That's the definition of a min radius turn that will, in theory, guarantee that you can make the turn in 150 feet of stressed pavement. And now at the second part of this, it says at gross weights of 732.5 and below, 60 degrees of nose landing gear deflection should be used during the MRT maneuver and allows the 150 feet. So like I just said, but if you're above 732.5, you can still do an MRT or a min radius turn maneuver. It's just limited to 45 degrees, which is going to increase your turn radius. And like it says there, it allows a turn on the runway between 198 and 218 feet, depending on the effectiveness of the caster. So that's just some numbers to know. 218, because it's a range, everybody's going to say 218 when they ask you about it, because you can't be on a 200-foot runway and be like, well, it could be 198 feet. You have to use the most conservative 218 feet, the end of that range there. So if you're above 732.5 and you need to do a 180, you need 218 feet of stressed pavement to be able to execute the turn. And then an uncasted 180, what a good time. For 180 degree turns without caster, if you're at 732.5 or below, you still use 60 degrees, up to 60 degrees of nose landing gear deflection. And that allows a 180 degree turn to be completed in 228 feet. This is using symmetric thrust and brakes with a speed of 4 to 5 knots. And above 732.5, if you're trying to do a 180 without caster, they don't know what to tell you because they didn't assess it. So you are kind of on your own on that one. And then at the bottom, you'll see story time. I just got to do 2 of them with Lily. And it was fun. So I'll talk about that at the end. I just threw this in here because I'll talk about like why I ended up doing uncastered 180s. So the alternate caster procedure, basically, if you have a failure of the normal caster, which is on system 1, it tells you, here's how you do alternate caster. But the caution at the bottom there, if you can see that, if hydraulic system number 1 is lost, alternate caster procedure should be avoided or kept to a minimum. The gear may not remain centered after releasing the aft main landing gear, bogey, emergency positioning switches. So the situation that we were in was we had not quite lost system 1. We were get ready to land at Eglin, and the engineers were like, hey, it looks like when we castered, we lost a lot of quantity in system 1. It looks like there's some sort of leak in the lines in the castering system. We still have system 1, we still have pressure, but the quantity is pretty close to not being useful. So don't use the castering system. It's not broken. If we need it, we can use it. But if we use it, we're expecting to have issues with system 1 quantity. So let's try not to. And then we talked about alternate caster while we were in the air as we were landing at Eglin. We were like, all right, do we want to alternate caster? And the thought process was we were landing there, spending the night, and then leaving. Eglin obviously has very little support, let alone any sort of C5 maintenance or anything like that. And the engineers were talking about this little caution in here where it says if you can avoid alternate caster, avoid it, just because you can't guarantee that you're going to get the main landing gear centered again. Obviously, we had not lost system 1, so sure we could have used it, but the kind of deciding factor for, hey, let's just do uncastered turns was that Eglin has 300-foot wide runways and 300-foot wide taxiways. So we just talked about you need 228 feet to do these uncastered 180s. We were fairly lightweight, and we were like, hey, let's just, not caster and mess with the quantity of system 1, and let's not use the emergency positioning switches and have to worry about whether or not the gear are going to center or if we're going to have issues with that and then be stuck at Eglin because we can't get the gear centered. And obviously, if you can't center the gear, you can't take off and leave and go to Travis. So that was why we ended up doing it. It was, I would say, less of a big deal than I might have thought it was. I was in the left seat with Forlini in the right seat. We lined up for a 180 just as you normally would with your 4 feet. We didn't caster. We just started the turn and moved into 60 degrees of nose landing gear. And anecdotally, I talked to some people about it the other day. I would say we maybe used up 200 feet of runway. I know that the Dash 1 says 228 feet, but it felt like it did a pretty good job of turning. Obviously, I think weight can be a factor. So we were fairly light because we landed with very little gas and we only had about 100,000 pounds of cargo, but it was interesting. Kind of a non-issue. Just make sure you know like what you are allowed to, caster to or not caster if you're going to not caster, but make sure you know like what your nose landing gear deflection can be and what the like width of runway you need is before you do that sort of stuff. It was fun. And then this is just a reminder of where your steering and castering stuff is. Normal steering for the nose landing gear is system 1 and emergencies on system 4. And then normally when we're castering, you get 20 degrees on the aft mains. It has asymmetry protection. Like we said, system 1 is for your normal castering, and then the beeper switches, the emergency positioners, are on system 4. But you're only supposed to bring them to 15 degrees for a turn. Technique says 12, so you don't overshoot. Cool. That's all the stuff that I talked about. We did a CT. It was on taxiing. We talked about some stuff that other people probably haven't talked about. I don't think that many people have talked about uncastered 180s. I certainly had never heard about one until I was in the seat doing one. So minus, having read it in the Dash 1 a couple times. But are there any questions? I know a lot of people joined late, so might not have heard everything. Got a lot of videos off, but I know you were all attentively listening to this fantastic brief.
Yeah, Zach, this is Leighton. I just had a quick question. When you actually were doing the uncastered 180, did it feel like sluggish at all, or did the jet feel pretty responsive? And then what was kind of your power input? I know you guys were like fairly lightweight, but did you like feather as normal and felt like it was too much power, or kind of? I just wanted to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I would say that it did feel a little bit like we were putting some stress on the nose landing gear, like not anything that I was like, oh, this is going to be a problem. Just it definitely felt different than like a normal castered turn would. I tried to use as symmetric of thrust as I could because it kind of tells you to. And I also noticed in the turn that if I kind of like went straight to 60 and kept it there like you do for a normal 180, that we would start to slow down almost to a stall. And so to kind of avoid that, I would, again, knowing I had 300 feet of runway, I felt like I was able to do this. I would move the nose landing gear from 60 over to like 50 to let the momentum kind of come back in. Obviously, I'm shooting for 45 knots, but I was getting as slow as like 2 or 3 and feeling like I was slowing. And so I would kind of bring some of that deflection out, and then I would feel kind of the momentum come back in just by changing the deflection by 10 degrees. And then I would bring it back in, if that makes sense. So that was kind of non-standard, something that you wouldn't typically do in a 180, that just kind of on the fly as I was doing it, having the extra space that I had. I didn't want to stall out in the uncastered turn, perpendicular to the runway at Eglin. So that was what I did.
Cool. Appreciate that. Thanks.
Yep. Anyone else? No one else. Cool. Well, I recorded this. I don't know if anyone will watch it, but I will send it out, and anyone that missed it can watch it.
Oh, I do have one thing I wanted to bring up here, Zach, and I could be saying this downstairs, I guess.
Yeah, we're in the same house right now.
So a trend I've noticed amongst a lot of people taxiing the left seat is not verifying during a caster turn that the main landing gear free lights come on. So this has been a big trend item I've seen lately. So I implore you guys and ask you guys to please verify that. Does anyone want to speak up and give me a reason why it's important to verify that those lights come on?
I can speak up because I've actually had them not come on. So I think we were in Camp Pendleton, getting ready to taxi, and I'm not going to say any names, but there was an instructor engineer that forgot to push in the circuit breakers for the caster power back. And so when the pilot went to caster, the free lights did not come on. So I was like, the lights are not on. So we had to stop the airplane and kind of check the circuit breakers. But if those lights aren't on, you want to make sure, see if the bogies are actually rotating, and they weren't. So.
And this is incredibly important. I mean, like, what if you were about to begin a 180 turn, 180 turn on a 150-foot wide runway, and you go to caster and you start turning and you don't get those free lights? You know what I mean? What are you going to do? So this is important. So please, I just ask you guys, verify, check it. I'm sure you guys have heard techniques about the co-pilot, calling it out. But regardless, you should always be verifying and looking at those free lights.
Sweet. I
Oh, yeah.
agree. Yeah, it was something that I discussed on my LTMs. Having co-pilots call it out, but then actually like making sure that it comes on. Um, does anyone else have a question or comment, or just a statement? Because I'm gonna end this meeting and be.
Don't end it. Just say it's over. So that way we can just chat.
Oh, okay. I'll stop recording.